Hey, greetings everybody. Hey, I wanted to follow up on that last video, the high gain thing, because I don't think it came out very good. Oh, and by the way, I really want to thank everybody for the comments. They're uniformly encouraging and positive. You guys seem to be enjoying this, so I really appreciate it. That third video, the high gain one, was actually the second one. And these are spontaneous, unplanned, just rambling, and that one sure showed it. So we posted it or published it, I guess you call it, without me looking at it. And if I had, I would have. Oh man, I can do better than that. For one thing, Lee Michaels, the song is "Stormy Monday." And I encourage you all to go check that out. It's up on YouTube, just the audio part, but it is worth it because the guy is a monster. And he was so innovative in so many different ways. One way I remember was that he had this go-kart that he had made with twin chainsaw engines on it that you literally laid down on. And we have a track up here close by, Sears Point, also known as Sonoma Raceway. It's an international track. They have Indy cars there, NASCAR races. And I've done a hell of a lot of racing out there, 26 years, and we'll get to that because those are some fun stories too. But Lee said, "Oh yeah, so I made this go-kart and I laid down in it, and it's like, wow. For one thing, if you survive it, you'll be deaf because you got these two chainsaw engines right on either side of your ears, and you're lying down with your feet out in front." Then he said, "Oh yeah, well there was a guy running a Daytona Ferrari there, and we were faster." And I said, "Oh," I'm thinking, nah, now I know enough about racing. Yeah, I'm sure you were. I'm sure you were. Sears Point is a very technical, windy, twisty track with lots of elevation changes and so forth. It's the most difficult track in several ways of the 24, 25 different tracks that I've raced at. One thing about it is it's a real high penalty for going off. And I look forward to telling you some of those racing stories because they were really fun, and I really met some great characters there. So that was Lee, part of his innovation, and part of it was, oh man, these Crown power amps. This is unheard of. This is the next frontier in terms of modern technology, and the coincidences just stack up because Lee was sold those amps via a friend of mine, George Heckman, who was the younger son of my high school sweetheart. And I mentioned earlier jacking up the houses. Well, we were jacking up this house in Forest Knolls, and we were under the house when it practically came down on us. And George was there helping us out. And he said, "Man, I can't get too bombed because I have to go for a job interview tomorrow. I'm going to try to get a job with this Pacific Stereo, and that was the very company that had just opened its doors in Berkeley, where I went down and bought $1 worth of parts from the owner in order to fix that Sun 200S. So what a small freaking world. And we're still pals. Not just George, but George and Lee and another character you're going to hear about, Patrick Burke, the first paying customer for me when I'm starving to death. Man, these are great people, and we're all still tremendously tight friends. Okay, so that's one thing. Lee Michaels, the Crown power amps, me making the preamp led to the invention, discovery, whatever you want to call it, of high gain. And his song that I couldn't remember the name was "Stormy Monday." Wow, it's a blues classic. How could I forget that? I'm an old geezer, that's how. Okay, so I wanted to get a little bit technical but not to bore you to death and not get so technical that you don't get it. But part of high gain is like, whoa, this distortion. Where does this distortion actually come from? Well, it's because you saturate, by overdriving, you saturate the ability of a tube to deliver the undistorted signal. In the most basic nutshell, here's how it works. Here's a tube, and then there's a resistor on top of the tube, and then there's the power supply on top of the resistor. And this would be like a one triode section of a 12AX7, the most commonly used and a wonderful tube, preamp tube. So you got this resistor, you got the power supply, and let's keep these numbers simple. They're not far off. But let's say the power supply is delivering 400 volts at the top of the resistor, and then you bias the tube so that the drop across the resistor to the tube is half of that. So you got 200 volts sitting on the plate of the tube. And so when a little signal, like that's coming from the guitar, modulates the current flowing through the tube, the drop from the resistor goes up and down, right? I don't know if you're still following me, but the tube is actually works like a valve. So a small change in the voltage on the control grid amounts to a big change in the voltage on the plate, because it's what it is, it's the drop across that resistor. So it starts with 400 volts, and when it's biased about the midpoint of Class A operation, you have 200 volts on the plate. So as the signal from the guitar modulates the current going through the tube, the voltage drop across that resistor changes, but it cannot go more than 400 volts, and it cannot go less than 0 volts. So if you have a small signal and you got this 200 volts sitting on the plate, maybe it's going between 250 and 150, okay? So that's right in the middle of the linear region, and it's not distorting. But when the signal hitting the tube is telling it that it needs to go to 600 or 800 volts, it can't, because it's not 600 volts isn't there. And it's also telling it to swing below 0. It can't go below 0 because there isn't anything below 0. And that's when it distorts. So it's, in a way, it's saturation. You could think of it another way. Think of how pasta is made, where you take a big lump of dough and you push it through some holes, right? Well, the holes shape it, okay? And you get to a certain point that no matter how hard you push, it still only comes out that shape. In a way, that's like what happens with the tube, is that you can't get more out of it than the size of that hole. But when you try, then the output is no longer the same as the input. It's distorted. And what's ironic is that pretty much everything in the entire history of amplification is all about reducing and eliminating distortion, right? Because when you're playing theater music, for example, which is where amplifiers first got started, when the movies became talkies, you know, they don't want to hear distortion. They want to hear what the material is. And when you record a symphony or somebody talking, you don't want distortion. But in a guitar amplifier and in the blues and the rock, and then going into heavy metal, distortion is this huge element of enhancement on the musical tone. You all know that. You know what I'm talking about, because if you only had linear hi-fi production, there would be no heavy metal. It would only sound like the same tonality that you would get out of an acoustic guitar sitting around the campfire. You know, you could play your power fifths and it wouldn't have the enhancement, and nor would it have the sustain. That's one thing that I mentioned Santana and his desire for sustain, because again, he's, man, I can't get no sustain, man. I hit a note and it dies out, it goes plink and dies out. And I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but I've never forgot him saying that, man, I hit a note and it died out. I felt like my dick fell off in front of it. That's a pretty good description, because he wanted to hit but an old Fender wouldn't do it. So when you have this huge amount of extra amplification and you're trying to force, again, the pasta analogy through, when the signal from the string vibration decays, the note tapers off, as you know. But if you've got, 40 times the amplification, the vibration from your string can decay by a tremendous amount, and it's still fully totally driving these tubes into saturation, where it's trying to go more than 400 volts and it's trying to go less than zero, and it can't do it. And that's when it produces harmonics, which are distortion characteristics that the right ones really enhance the tone and make it fat and expressive. The wrong ones sound really annoying and like a mosquito buzz on Viagra. And that's what transistors, by the very character, want to do, because they run out of headroom really quickly and really harshly. And so that puts out square wave distortion. Because again, think of it this way. A transistor wants to work like a switch. It wants to either be on or it wants to be off. The middle in between range, no, that's hard to do. It doesn't really want that very much. The tube, exactly the opposite. It doesn't really want to be fully on. It doesn't really want to be fully off, but it wants to operate in the region in between, which is what music is. It's analog. So a tube valve is by nature a great element for recording and producing music, because it's inherently analog. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get great transistor stuff. You can. You just usually don't want it to distort because of the harmonics that it produces. And again, let's talk about the harmonics. Well, any of you musicians know that there are certain harmonics that are consonant rather than dissonant with the fundamental tone. And the first one, of course, is the second harmonic. It's the same frequency, but an octave higher, so it's double the frequency. The fifth is a powerful one, and in fact, this is interesting because there used to be, and this is going back to some of the race car stuff, Joe Huffaker was a huge influence in the Bay Area in racing, and he had a shop right kitty corner to Mesa Boogie in Petaluma that included an engine dynamometer. And man, we were listening to these engines while we were doing the dual rectifier. We're going, listen to that, man. First of all, we were expecting them to blow up because and the thing is just screaming. And we're listening, and it was like, man, that's a heavy metal harmonics. That's got this huge fifth harmonic in there, is what the American V8. And I swear, I think that's where some of the relationship of why heavy metal sounds so recognizable is. It just sounds so powerful and badass. And we all grew up, and I mean, most of us Americans, especially of my age, we all grew up with V8 cars. Now, four-cylinder, yeah, sure, great, no problem about that. But there's something about the harmonics of a V8, particularly a V8 dragster engine, that's just mind-blowingly powerful and badass sounding. And man, if you listen to the harmonics of a heavy metal open fifth, it's so similar. Like Dougie and me, Tone Boy, Doug West, we'd be laughing. We're listening to that. Listen to what they're doing. Is that thing going to blow up? Or at any rate, so I got to know all those guys out at the racetrack. Joe, and in fact, when I had my little British sports car, I went over and bought some headers and stuff from the guy, the father. And again, he was just one of the great guys. And this whole racing deal, it's the same as what I'm doing, is hot rodding shit, right? I take a standard Fender amp and I hot rod it. It's not much different than the taking a Chevy engine and hot rodding it, taking a Ford flathead and which of course was the beginning. And we'll get back to that, because one of the guys that I always admired and grew up with, Mel Dixon, he was the king of the flatheads. And by the way, if any of you are familiar with the movie American Graffiti, where the Harrison Ford character with his 55 or 56 Chevy, he's beaten everybody in San Rafael, which, by the way, is so close to our hometown. It's right in between Lagunitas and Petaluma is San Rafael. So after the Harrison Ford character is, okay, you're going to go out and take on John, whatever his name is, that's Mel freaking Dixon. And he goes over the hill out to Lagunitas area and races the guy. And of course, if you remember the movie, the Harrison Ford character crashes out. But Mel Dixon, man, he was on the cover of Hot Rod magazine in 57. I think he was a classic. He had the flat top with it and the Lucky Strikes rolled up, and I'd see him down at the bar and he'd be sipping his long neck bud, just waiting for that door to come to slamming open. Are you Mel Dixon? I'm choosing you out. And he'd stuff out his Lucky Strike and, okay, I got to go out and do it again, you know. And that road out there, the road to Lagunitas, that's the drag strip, all right. And by the way, y'all have heard of Lagunitas now because of Lagunitas Brewing. But one of the crazy things that Raven and I did was we made beer in Lagunitas long before, what's his name? See, here I am again. I'm having a senior moment. The guy who founded Lagunitas Brewing. Great guy. And Lagunitas Brewing was right across the street from Mesa Boogie until they got too big and they moved around the corner in what looks like the brewery is just this huge, fabulous facility. And they are tons of fun. They do beer the way we did amps. You go, hey, try this. This isn't for sale. This is just something we did for fun. And it's kind of a similar aesthetic. So now, wait a minute. I'm supposed to be talking about high gain here. So let's get back to that. I think I mentioned it, how the tube actually distorts because it can't go higher than the power supply voltage and it can't go lower than 0. And when it tries to, that's when the output no longer resembles the input and all those distortion harmonics are added. Now, once again, just a review. In the entire history of amplification, every other patent, except the ones that I've written, is about how to get rid of distortion, and mine are about how to create distortion. So I think the next video, and I can't remember if I go into this or not, the patent guy says, wait a minute, this won't work. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's going to distort. And I thought, well, that's the point. But it was so foreign to the guy. It was like, oh, I'm going to add food poisoning onto the menu here. He just couldn't conceive of it. And again, it's one reason why I was able to come along when Fender was working hard to reduce the amount of distortion. They were going for the hi-fi thing. That was the difference between blackface and tweed. Tweed had more gain. It tended to distort more, which is the characteristics everybody liked. That Bassman 410, not a great bass amp, but man, the distortion characteristics and the fact that it had more gain and would distort. And if I may take a little side trip here to acknowledge what happened in England, is that same circuit, the 410 Bassman circuit, is what the Marshall Plexi was, part for part, until they started changing a few things. The crucial difference was the Marshall used EL34 power tubes because 6L6s were too expensive in England because of they had a patent on what's called the beam power design. I'd like to go into that sometime for your tube geeks because it's really interesting. Now's not the time. The crucial thing is the EL34 is more sensitive than a 6L6, meaning for the same amount of signal voltage going in, you're going to get a bigger output, which means it's going to clip sooner. So the same circuit as the 410 Bassman, but with EL34s, it's going to overdrive more, right? Now here's another, so that's an accident. And a lot of the shit that we've come up with is just an accident. And there's another one that I want to mention. We love Celestion speakers, but if you've ever been to England, England has got the great train railroad. Everything's connected by railroads, and that all began in the 1800s or maybe even before. But every station has these little speaker cabinets that are the PA system with 112 speakers in them. And they're the train to London will be leaving in 5 minutes on track 5. You've seen this in old movies and stuff. Well, those are all Celestion speakers. Celestion 12s. And my theory is, I haven't heard this proven, but I bet it's true, is that the reason why all the old cool British amps had Celestions was they were probably stolen from these little PA announcement speakers at every damn little train stop in England. So why not? They didn't have a lot of money. There's a speaker. Nobody's here. Well, let's come here at 3 in the morning and let's take the speaker out of there. So is that true? I don't know, but I like to think it is. It's a great story, and I bet you some guys have done that. And again, Celestion speakers, oh man, I'm just rambling here, but we worked so closely with Celestion on the minutest details. Because once again, things would change. We go, wait a minute, what happened? These speakers don't sound right anymore. Oh, well, we used to stake the magnet on, now it's glued on. Well, that doesn't sound right anymore. Don't send us, we're sending those back. And now we're going to, so when it's the same old story. Celestion got bought, the manufacturing was moved 95% to England, and we said, those don't work for us. We are not going to use those. And I got to credit Celestion with going, okay, well, what do you guys want? And even at one point, they changed the plating on it, and that changed the way it sounded. I mean, again, it is shocking how every little, you paint the frame instead of putting a cadmium coat, it sounds different. And all of these little, you would think an engineer would say, that can't matter. Well, you listen to it, and it does. Brings back another story. We used to love the JBL D120s, and we stopped using them. They changed them. They were the Ks and then something else, and then they weren't right anymore. And so finally they sent a guy around, and he said, okay, I got these newest speakers, and here, let me show you. I've got the anechoic chamber. It's exactly the same frequency response as this Celestion that you guys like. And we said, okay, great, let's hear it. And so we don't have an anechoic chamber. We got these devices right here. And so we set up two 112 open back cabinets side by side with an AB foot switch, so we can instantly switch right in the middle of a note or a chord. We can switch between one or two of them. So play it clean. Yeah, it sounds okay. It sounds pretty damn close. It's acceptable. Let's crank it up into distortion. Oh, there's that mosquito on Viagra tone, that horrible sound in harmonics. And this JBL engineer, he was like, his jaw just dropped, because everything that they had done with all of their research and their high-tech crap, and once he heard what we were doing, it was just like, oh, he was embarrassed and ashamed. And which reminds me of how I felt when I took that preamp over to Lee's and it didn't work. Except it did work. We just he had plugged it in wrong. So Lee Michaels, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. If you weren't a crazy guy always looking for the next radical, weird thing, who knows? I might have eventually come up with high gain, but I may not have, and maybe nobody else would have either. I don't know. But that's the way it happened. So is it half by accident, half by inspiration? Interestingly enough, in terms of patent legitimacy, makes no distinction between an accidental discovery and a discovery that's the result of millions of dollars of research. They're both equally valid. So you can't say, oh yeah, well, they studied this and calculated it out and did it with their spectrum analyzer, and you just did it by accident, so you don't deserve that. No, they didn't do it, first of all. And just because we were smoking dope and crazy, and what's the next radical thing, whether it's a Crown amp or a suicide machine called a go-kart with two McCulloch chainsaw engines, right? That's what we were doing. Oh, and one other detail, since I'm just, spontaneously bubbling off the top of my head, when I was still working at Prune Music in Mill Valley, and I think I either mentioned or I will mention moving out to the shop because there was just too much partying, dope smoking, and which was all fun. It was just hard to get work done. Our favorite band, the Sons of Champlin, Bill Champlin, a freaking genius. Those guys, they were, in our humble opinions, that was the Bay Area band that should have been on the top of the heap. Phenomenal. Terry Haggerty on guitar, Bill Champlin singing. Go on, look them up. Look up Goldmine, for example. Look up any of the Sons of Champlin on YouTube. You'll see what I'm talking about. So they would bring their roadies, again, that's what we called them then, Charlie Kelly, they would bring their truckload of gear into Prune, drop it off, and then go around the corner to Mill Valley Cyclery. At this exact same time that we were doing this radical amplifier go-kart stuff, they were inventing mountain bikes. Now, Mill Valley is just at the end of the Golden Gate Bridge. Right, you get off the Golden Gate Bridge, you're practically in Mill Valley. And looming there is this beautiful Mount Tamalpais, just a gorgeous spiritual. If you haven't seen Mount Tamalpais, you come to the Bay Area, make it a point to go to the top of Mount Tam and walk around it. There's a flat path there. You'll never forget it. So these guys were riding these bicycles at high speed down the dirt fire roads. And the bike frames were breaking. So what they realized, oh man, maybe a Schwinn old balloon tire, maybe that's a strong enough frame that it won't break. And that was true. So they started hot rodding them by putting on the Shimano gears and all all of the good stuff that they could do. But they still had coaster brakes on them, the kind where you pedal backwards and that's the brake. Now, so the most famous run became named as repack because when you come hauling ass down and use the brakes, and these guys are doing these big drifts and sliding and crashing, and it's just chaos, just great stuff. The hub where the coaster brake was would get so hot that all of the grease would run out of it, so it had to be repacked every time. So this is repack, the same crazy ass guys, all of us were at that time, that invented, high gain, channel switching. Well, it's actually mode switching. We'll get into that later. Mountain bikes, crazy ass shit. It was all happening right there in Mill Valley, and around Mill Valley, and out in Lagunitas. Again, we made the beer. And here's another funny little story. I had lived on the Spring lot. That house that I jacked up, that was Spring Road and the Spring lot. It used to have this giant redwood tank there that some criminal tore it down, which broke my heart. But the spring was right up above my kitchen, and I ran a pipe down. And so we had this fresh spring water. I had my good buddy, Mike Lipskin, over, a great piano player, played stride piano, look it up, played Carnegie Hall a couple of times. And he's the funniest guy. He's a combination of Groucho Marx and Woody Allen. And so I pour him this enormous whiskey, and I got the ice in there, it's whiskey. And I said, Mike, would you like some spring water in there? And he said, no, thanks. I'm driving. I'm going to leave you with that. Tune in next time. We'll see what comes up. Thanks again. Take care.